Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. You guys are in for a treat. My next guest, Ashley Rindsberg, has been recommended to me repeatedly over the last year because his most recent book, I want to get the title and subtitle exactly right, The Gray Lady Winked, How the New York Times Misreporting, Distortions, and oh, it went away. And Fabrications radically alter history. Ashley, you and I covered a lot of similar ground as I did in the White Pill, and that's how you came on my radar screen. Um, One of the things that drives me crazy on the online right is this idea that no one reads the New York Times anymore. It doesn't matter. Joe Rogan, all this other stuff, and it is completely delusional, in my opinion. That No King's March was entirely, synthetic, and the New York Times played into that. I would love to hear your thoughts on where you see the role of the New York Times in American culture in 2025.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and it's really debated. But the New York Times is still the 800-pound gorilla in the information room. I mean, I at some point, I think it was even about a year ago, I looked up their monthly unique visitors. I thought it would be like 100, 200 million. It was 600 million at that time. That's wild. And that's not taking into account the effect it has
Right.
in setting the news agenda and driving coverage and shaping the narrative around us. So yeah, we've got Rogan, but this isn't zero sum. It's just it's adding on, and it's often case it's not overlapping. So you still have so much of the country tuned into this stuff, and when we sort of um, turn our turn our attention away from the media and pretend that like it doesn't exist anymore, what we're not understanding is the extent to which the majority of the country is still dependent on the media for news, for information, and for the overriding political and social narratives that we're seeing arise.
Yeah, I was talking to a guest recently from Wikipedia, and this idea, there's no right of center equivalent to the New York Times, because Joe Rogan might be the equivalent maybe of a Colbert in terms of who he is and what he represents, obviously not in terms of audience share, but Fox or Newsmax or anything else, there's nothing that has the reach, the status, the gravitas of the Times at all. The Wall Street Journal might have somewhat of a conservative editorial board and editorial page, but it's hardly a go-to for people who are right of center. There's nothing like it. And I had Curtis Yarvin on the show, and me and him are buddies, and he has this metaphor that if I were this kind of conquering alien race, who would I want to conquer? The Supreme Court, the Senate, or the New York Times? He's like, of course, the New York Times, because everything else is kind of downstream from that. Do you think they've lost or gained or kind of stayed the same in terms of their influence over the last decade?
That's a great question. I think it's more or less stayed the same. I think they have done this really amazing shift to digital that they pulled off largely on account of the current publisher and the chairman of the New York Times Company, A.G. Sulzberger. Um, they're still just enormous, and in a way, they have gained market share because I think their strategy, their business strategy, is to be not just number one, but the only one. When they
Yeah.
start to understand that, like, we are now in just a single massive national news market, like, you don't really have segmented regional and local news markets the way you once did. They understood that very early at the New York Times. And they came to the determination, as they always do, that they need to be, again, not just number one, but in this case, the only one. And I think they're well on their way to achieving that. Washington Post is sort of the closest next competitor. It's just kind of like stumbling around, fumbling around, like they've got all these internal wars. Not to say the New York Times is it's all rosy, it's not. But they are marching towards this huge digital strategy. And at the end of the day, people who are going to start subscribing to a news outlet today, meaning they're younger and they're going to start subscribing for the next 10, 20 years plus, they're going to have to make one choice. They're not going to go out and subscribe to 5 newspapers. They're going to subscribe to one newspaper, just like we used to do back in the day when we had a physical newspaper. And I think for most people, it's going to be the New York Times. I mean, the data is bearing that out. Their numbers are bearing that out.
Yeah, there's a New York Times bestseller list, which I feel the need to point out to people is not at all, does not pretend to be objective. It's not literally the 10 most popular books in terms of sales for a category. They weight it heavily in terms of independent bookstores, which I think might be that might you can make the argument for that being a good thing, support them, sure, but they don't explain to anyone, even New York Times employees, what the sauce is to create these rankings. And yet there's Amazon sales rankings, sure, which are more objective, but there's nothing at all that's like second tier in terms of the New York Times bestseller list in terms of status within the publishing industry. And in fact, this is a big issue for Regnery. Regnery is an old school, independent, conservative publisher. They publish a lot of great people, a lot of great books. And because of this unfairness, they felt the New York Times was there correctly, stacking the deck against them. They no longer submitted their books to the New York Times bestseller list, which for a lot of their authors, like, you screwed me out of having that credential. So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, the Times has argued in court, no less, that the bestseller list is what they consider to be an editorial property, meaning there are editors who make the decisions. It's not a numbers driven thing. It's not a data thing. It's not, like you said, it's not the most popular book of the week or the month. It's just whatever the New York Times decides, because they got sued over this issue. So they said, well, we have the right to make whatever decision, whatever determination we want, which is now true. And in the case of conservative publishers and conservative books, we know for a fact that books that have done extremely well are excluded from the list because they don't match whatever prerogative the New York Times has for putting books onto the list. The As you're kind of alluding, like the by far the most powerful marketing tool in all of book publishing is the New York Times bestseller list. Like, just saying those words
Yep.
has a magic to it, has a charm to it. To the New York Times credit, because they built this thing over the course of decades. They've, again, with the thing people miss about the New York Times is, like, you can like zoom out like I did with my book and look at the cases where they just royally messed up history. A lot of the times it was deliberate. But what sort of gets missed in this conversation is just how savvy and how canny and how expert they are at building this institution over the course of over a century by now, when we're talking about the Sulzberger dynasty.
Yeah, it's really funny because when I see people look at Jasmine Crockett and think, everyone on the left is like that, and it's like, well, that actually is a better example than you think because she's quite educated and she's putting on a show, and people aren't able to distinguish between what they see in front of them and what's really going on because they don't know they're seeing a screen on their computer and their window. And there's lots of footage. People don't believe me of Jasmine Crockett dropping that, ghetto accent. I think she went to some fancy private school and so on and so forth. And it's the same thing, I think, with, the left in general. People might see that idiot on Twitter. From whatever you are politically, you're going to find plenty of idiots, but they don't realize, what, the people running the New York Times are not dumb. And they've been at this for a long time, and they could also outlast any single administration quite easily.
Yeah, they are entrenched. I mean, like,
That's the word, yeah.
when you look at the Sulzbergers, which still controls the newspaper, we're at, like, I guess 5 generations by now. This is a literal dynasty. So they hand power down. It's primogeniture. They hand power down from male heir to male heir to male heir. They all have the same names. They're all called Arthur Sulzberger, for like at least the last 4 generations of Sulzbergers. And that kind of power, that kind of dynastic power, has an amazing ability to perpetuate and replicate itself over time. And the thing that people often ask me about the Times, when I say, okay, they covered up the Ukraine famine and they had a Nazi running their Berlin bureau during World War II and all this other stuff, people say to me, how could they stay number one if they're doing all this crazy stuff and they're making all these errors? And my answer to them is that they do these things in order to stay number one. So when you look at the through line, they support fascism and Nazism in the late 1930s, mid 1930s, and immediately preceding that, they're seemingly supporting Stalinism. They don't care. That's that they, for the most part, like any dynasty, they don't actually care. They care about the power. They care about the prestige. They maybe care about the money, but the money's just kind of baked in. So you will make any sacrifice necessary to stay in that number one position. And that obviously includes the truth, which is often a huge obstacle to winning.
Yeah, I think people need to, because there's these two kind of irreconcilable views people have, which is one is that these outlets are run by, ideologues who only want to spread their ideas, and the second is these outlets are run by people who are only interested in power and will throw anyone under the bus in order to seize and maintain it. You can't have both. It's one or the other. And for me, especially with these like long term institutions like the Times or Harvard, it's very clearly the second and not the first. And often these groups will be of use to further their, furthering their power for but the second it goes bad, if we sat down right now and went back in time a year ago, 1 year, and said, in a year from now, Penn State will not only strike Leah Thomas from all the sporting, but will apologize for having had a transgender swimmer compete against biological females. Everybody like, okay, take off your MAGA hat. You're delusional. That's never going to happen. Maybe they'll pull back, but apologize. Come on. It happened. And yet people still can't kind of grok, to use that awful term, that this is how these people operate.
This is an organization that depends on being able to not just determine public opinion and shape it, which they do, but also flow with it. They cannot flow. They cannot sail into the wind like any sailing vessel like this. They have to sail to an extent with it. And they're really good at taking the temperature, and they're really good at being able to do that. I don't think in this environment today, the New York Times would dare to come out with something like the 1619 Project, which they marched out in 2019, like right at the moment where like BLM is just kind of breaking into the culture, and the 1619 Project being this editorial initiative, this marketing initiative, actually,
Yep.
to reframe American history from one that's rooted in liberty to one that's rooted in slavery. So the first slaves came to the colonies in 1619. Therefore, America's true birth was not 1776. It's this other date. They timed that perfectly. They timed it perfectly to just catch that enormous wave that they could ride for the next 4 to 5 years until it kind of like exhausted itself, and it's no longer fashionable. It's no longer like the right thing for them to do economically or for the brand, and they stop and they do something different. Now it's kind of leaning into like this new online fringe thing where they have like Nick Fuentes looking good in photos and Hassan Piker looking good in photos. It's all about the youth, and again, it's part of their business strategy. They need to attract subscribers. They've shifted their model away from advertising because advertising online and news just doesn't work. And they've shifted towards subscription. And for subscription, you want to be able to acquire subscribers, which is a costly process that will pay you for years, if not decades. And that means going younger. They know they have to do that. And putting out these characters like Piker and Fuentes, even though they're on other ideological ends of the spectrum, and yes, they're critical of Fuentes. They're not so critical of Piker, but they still made him look good. They're still elevating his profile in a way that like actually glazes him with a bit of credibility, even as they quote unquote attack him.
Yeah, they both of them are treated better by the Times by far than Trump was at any point in the last decade.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Trump is just this like this boogeyman for the New York Times, for the media. He still is to this day. They're still just pounding away at that narrative. It's not just them, of course. It's a whole institutional thing in media, online, on Wikipedia, which is something I cover extensively. We see the same thing, but it is a very strange thing when you see Nick Fuentes in this photo of him taken by a photographer. I pointed this out in a tweet. The photographer usually photographs political figures and makes them look really bad, really dodgy, sketchy. The lighting's awful. He does this like reverb effect visually that makes it just look like disorienting. And then we get this photo of the New York Times of Nick Fuentes. They're like, oh my God, this is like James Dean, teen idol. Like what? And Nick Fuentes is not that good a looking guy, or not at all good looking. So what is going on here? Why are they doing that? There's a decision being made there. There's an editorial process that leads to them choosing that photo. Whereas if you take a photo of RFK Jr. from the New York Times, he looks terrible. So why? And again, a lot of this tracks back to where they want to take the business, not just the newspaper.
So why do you think that they're having this kind of binary approach?
Like I said, I think it's really about building this next generation of subscribers, building a generation of subscribers who relate to what they see on the New York Times visually, as well as what they see in the content of articles. Just that the same way that people who are younger people and they go on X, or they go on wherever they're going, Blue Sky or TikTok or whatever, and they're seeing this type of imagery, and the New York Times wants to participate in that visual conversation. So that's what they do. Hassan Piker is everything is sort of whitewashed, and what we get is this like image of like a guy who's really fashionably dressed or looking very trendy, and he is like part of the New York Times universe, and that's what they want.
Folks, as some of you know, I worked on the Paleo Manifesto with John Durant, and one of the things that the paleo people are really into is organic, and not in the stupid way, organic supplements that will help your body achieve optimum health. And I want to talk to you a bit about cowboy colostrum. So if you don't know what colostrum is, it's the first milk mammals produce after giving birth. It's not like regular milk. It's thicker, richer, packed with hundreds of bioactive ingredients that help support immunity, gut health, hair, skin, nails, athletic performance, which makes it especially helpful during seasonal transitions, because that's when our immune systems tend to be put to the test. Think of it as nature's original multivitamin, but designed by biology, not in a lab. People have reported better digestion, thicker hair, glowing skin in a good way, not literally, and feeling healthier as the season changes. Here's what you do. You mix 1 scoop of the powder into coffee, milk, smoothies, whatever, and it comes in different flavors: vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, made with real freeze-dried berries. Unlike other colostrum brands, Cowboy Colostrum is never diluted, never spray-dried, and always sourced from grass-fed cows on regenerative U.S. farms. No fillers, no junk, just the good stuff, and it is hormone-free, allergen-free, grass-fed, and third-party tested. Athletes love it for performance and recovery, and everyone else loves it just for general wellness. For a limited time, our listeners get 25% off their entire order. Just head to cowboycolostrum.com, that's COLOSTRUM, and use code MALICE at checkout. As a Texan, I will endorse the Cowboy Colostrum over the non-cowboy brands. It's definitely better. 25% off when you use code MALICE at cowboycolostrum.com. After you purchase, they'll ask you where you heard about them. Support us and tell them Michael Malice sent you. And then you'll be telling me you're welcome. And I'll be saying, I told you so. I spent way too much time watching police body cam videos on YouTube. And some of them are funny, but some of them are absolutely terrifying. And that's why I got another unit of home protection. I don't know if I can mention it on YouTube, for my house in case someone breaks in. But that's not where security stops, because that's where Simply Safe comes in. Simply Safe is an AI-powered camera system. They detect threats while they're still outside your house, and they alert real security agents. This is the game changer. The agents take action while the intruder is still outside. They confront the intruder, letting them know they're being watched on camera, that police are on their way, and they even sound a loud siren and trigger a spotlight if needed. It's like in a cartoon. This is great. This is how you stop a crime before it starts. That's real security. Other systems have cameras that let you talk to intruders, but they require you to see the alert yourself. Simply Safe has monitoring agents that have your back, and they talk to intruders even if they aren't there. There are no long-term contracts or hidden fees. You can cancel anytime, and they've been named by U.S. News and World Report as the best home security system for 5 years in a row. Not only that, there's a 60-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it and see the difference for yourself. Folks, this is Simply Safe's biggest sale of the year. You get exclusive early access to their Black Friday sale. You can save 60% on any new system. There will never be a better time to get real security for your home. So just go to simplysafe.com/malice. That's simplisafe.com/malice, simplysafe.com/malice to start getting security that you can trust. Let's get back to the show. Let's talk a bit about your book and some of these historical just atrocities that you uncovered. I think it's very hard to get people to understand that a lot of times there's this narrative in normie world where, look, everyone makes mistakes in their jobs. True. Reporters are working in tough conditions with limited information. People are going to lie to them to further their own agenda, inevitably. Sometimes they're going to get the story wrong. When they get it wrong, they try to fix it. But if someone was systemically, incorrect, that person wouldn't have a job. Look at who wrote A Million Little Pieces? What was his name?
James Fry.
Yeah, James Fry. As soon as he was uncovered, they gave him the boot. So this claim that this is being done intentionally is really this right-wing conspiracy theory fever dream. Like, what is your answer to that?
It's really weird that you mentioned James Fry, because I was just thinking about him this morning. And one of the things that sticks out, he talks about this when he went on Oprah and she castigated him for not telling a fully truthful story about his memoir. He said his book sales went through the roof. And when she had him back on to apologize, they went even further through the roof. So it's just this weird attention economy thing in that case. But in the case of the New York Times and the journalistic transgressions that we see with them, it's never the thing that you just described, the phenomenon of someone just making a mistake, even a really bad mistake. It's never that. At least not in the stories that are covered in the book. So in the first case, we have the first chapter, is chronologically, it's not the first, but in the first chapter in the book, we have a story of this Berlin bureau chief for the New York Times, Guido Inderis, who just put out such sympathetic stories and narrative toward the Nazis that the Nazis would just read the New York Times reporting on German broadcasts uncensored. And when the Germans finally rounded up all the American reporters after war broke out, they left one in his fancy Berlin Hotel Avalon, and that was Guido Inderis. And it was explicitly stated by a German officer that they did this because of his, quote, proven friendliness to Germany. Okay, fine. Maybe you have a bad apple. The problem with that is that the New York Times knew about it because a Jewish editor in New York, a sort of junior editor, went to the publisher, and this was one of the Sulzbergers I was talking about, and told him, you cannot have a Nazi sympathizer running the Berlin bureau of the New York Times. And the response by the publisher and the top brass of the Times was to say, if you talk about this publicly, we will sue you for libel.
Is that right?
That's 100% correct.
How do we know this?
It's been reported in books about the Times, and it is sort of on the record. It's cited in my book. I can go and look at the exact citation, but that happened. And the reason, again, going back to what it said earlier, the reason that happened, the reason they pushed back on him in such a crazy way, and we're talking about Jewish people at the time. They're not Jewish anymore, but at the time they were running this newspaper, owning the newspaper. The reason they pushed back on him is because if they were to replace Inderis at that moment, they would have no one that could run the bureau the way that Inderis did. And the reason he was so good at it is because he got access to the best Nazi press and the sources because they loved him. He printed stuff that they loved. They said, yes, sure, interview, come. We'll give you the information, whatever you want. And this was all in service of staying number one. If we look at the case with Walter Duranty, who you read about in The White Pill, the Duranty thing is really well reported. There's a lot of information about Duranty. Duranty, we know, covered up the Ukraine famine. That is bad, and it could be chalked up to a guy who was sloppy and just didn't really get the story right, it happens. But that's not what happened here. And Duranty himself is on record saying he knew that there was a famine. He knew that this was going on. He denied it publicly. He not only denied it that there was a famine, he denied the reporting of other reporters who said that there was a famine.
Wait. He also denied that reporters should be reporting. He
Yep.
said something to the effect of, "You guys looking into this more is a waste of breath, and you shouldn't do it." Which, to see any reporter in writing say to other reporters, "Stop investigating," I couldn't believe it was that explicit. I've never heard that before or since. I'm sure you have in your research, but to me, it just blew my mind.
Yes. And the question that I ask myself with regard to Durante is, why would he say that? If he knew that there was a famine, why would he say that there wasn't? That's not a good story. There's no journalist wants to tell the readers a story that, oh wait, sorry, this massive thing just didn't happen. No one
Right.
would ever. There's no incentive. If you know that the thing is happening, your overriding incentive as a journalist is to tell people, not just because it's the right ethical thing to do in your job, but because you want to make yourself better known as a journalist. And Durante, of all people, was that guy. He was the travel around the world doing book tours. The New York Times would report about Durante, not they would report on him, because he was an international figure at that time. Later on, Durante actually revealed he had to go to the U.S. Embassy to renew his passport somewhere in Europe. I forget exactly where the location was, but he's in the embassy and he tells the officer, American embassy officer, that his reporting, the New York Times reporting, was always in line with the Soviet prerogative, the Soviet talking points on a given topic. And I think there's two things to understand here. One is the access to sources, that
Right.
same Inderis effect. Durante was gifted an interview with Stalin after he denied the Ukraine famine. That was a major get, as you say in media, massive. Like you talk about one or two in your book. You talk about one or two people who had that opportunity. I forget who it was. I think it was one of Stalin's Western sort of journalistic henchmen.
H.G. Wells.
Okay, H.G. Wells, which is sad for me
I
because I
think it was
love him.
H.G. Wells. Yeah.
It's
I'll
sad.
double, I'll
That's a
double
sad,
check right
sad
now.
thing to hear. But there's another piece to the story about Durante, which is that at the time, the United
Yeah, it was
States.
H.G. Wells. Yeah. 1934.
Okay, that's a shame. Great writer. Um,
But he also, as I covered it in the White Pill, H.G. Wells, whose books still hold up and are widely read, The Invisible Man, Time Machine, there's a ton of them. He said, "It seems to me Stalin's more moderate than I am." So in terms of when someone of that caliber and stature, whose name still resonates 100 years later, says to you, this guy's not that bad. He's really like smack dab in the middle of the Overton window. That carries a lot.
yeah, and it wasn't just Wells. In
Of course.
my chapter on Durante and the failure, it was a cultural milieu in the West that include George Bernard Shaw, um, another writer for the New York Times named Ella Winters, who was actually, unbeknownst to the Times, a Soviet agent writing in the Times about how amazing this Soviet wonderland was. But the context here that's really important was that the United States had not at that time recognized the Soviets as the legitimate government of Russia after the revolution. And partly what that meant was that you don't have trade agreements. Like, you don't have access to that enormous market that it was. It was the fastest industrializing and biggest market for American trade, for exporters and for import. So Durante actually goes to FDR before Roosevelt became president, when he was governor, and strongly advises him to, if he becomes president, to recognize the Soviet Union as the government. Again, you think, why would he do that? Finally, we fast forward. FDR is elected, and there is this gala event at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, where you have the Russian ambassador to the U.S., the new U.S. ambassador to Russia present, and all the bigwigs of American business. We're talking railroad people, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's son was there, banking heads, steel magnates. The whole game was there. Only one person the entire night got a standing ovation, and that was Walter Durante. And the reason,
No, he did get
in
a full standing ovation. I'm sure FDR didn't stand.
I don't think he was there,
No.
but had he been, he would have clapped very enthusiastically. Um, but the reason he got that ovation is because I think the room understood the service he had done to paving the way for American recognition of the Soviet Union as the government of Russia. Why? Because no American president would grant that recognition if that government had just murdered 5 million of, or 5 to 10 million of its own people through a campaign, a deliberate campaign of starvation. You would just not get away with that in terms of American public opinion. So the New York Times just paved over it. Walter Duranty paved over it. And he got the standing ovation at that event of honoring the recognition by the US of the Soviets. And again, this is the bigger picture. This is not about just one guy going rogue, as the New York Times put it later. And when we had in the early 2000s, there was this question of whether or not the New York Times should give Duranty's Pulitzer Prize back, sort of like rescind it, which they hired this historian to assess the thing. This historian comes back after like doing his historian stuff and says, yeah, you should give it back. This is like not legitimate at all. And they refused to give it back. They refused to recant, to rescind the award on Duranty's behalf. They made up a bunch of excuses. So what you see here is not the failure of a single reporter. It is the deliberate misdirection of an institution. And this is where it completely changes the lens on these two issues that we've discussed, and also a host of others.
So I think it doesn't stop there. From my understanding, and I haven't done this research, and I hope you have. When it came to Mao, who was even bloodier than Hitler and Stalin combined, they were also ball washing him. No.
I have heard about this. I haven't done a lot of the research into Mao. Unfortunately, I didn't get there, but it wouldn't surprise me. Let's put
So,
it that way.
do you talk about the Iraq War as well? Because that's something where I think a lot of people forget. And they really set Bush up in a sense. Not that I have any sympathy for George W. Bush or his administration, but they were beating that war drumbeat very heavily. And then when it went to shit, as I don't know if it would have been inevitable, I would argue, but I can see maybe I'm wrong. They just flipped on him, and then every single day, disaster, 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 disaster. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that or your reporting.
Yes, and that this like there's two back-to-back scandals of the New York Times that happened exactly in the framework you just described. The first is Judy Miller, who is the reporter who so-called corroborated, confirmed the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and she did it in the New York Times. So part of this, again, it's the institutional context that really counts here. Because what we have with the Judy Miller affair is that Judy Miller gets blamed for this, and like she takes the fall. It's very ugly. But before Judy Miller, the explosion happens with her, you have this new executive editors, the top editor at the New York Times, come into power, named Howell Raines. And Raines comes in. They'd had this sort of, the New York Times had this like bad period of losing out scoops to the Washington Post. The Washington Post is hard on their heels, is starting to like basically encroach on their turf as the number one newspaper. And Howell Raines comes in and says, we are going to be the red-blooded American newspaper that a national audience wants, because this is right at the time where they start to see that the shift is taking place away from regional and local news and towards national news. They understand they need to capture the entire country, which is both blue, as it is in New York, and red, which is a lot of the rest of the country. So he says vocally, we are not going to shy away from that kind of red-blooded reporting, even if it seems to be in support of the Bush administration and some of its key policies. We're not going to shy away from it. We're going to go after that stuff. In that context, they're all just kind of raring for scoops. And back to what I said about Duranty, it's not a story if you say there's nothing here. If it's not a story if you say there's no there. It is a story if you say, oh my God, this is like we have justification for this war that's about to start. You can just like feel it's happening. We have weapons of mass destruction or evidence of it in Iraq. Judy Miller, there's this infamous story about these these like metal tubes that were supposed to be used in the process of developing whatever WMD process. I think it was nuclear. And one of the key stories, she's in some like abandoned some field somewhere in the desert or something, and the source in the story is just a guy standing 100 feet away from her. She's not allowed to approach him. She's not allowed to ask him a question. He's wearing a baseball cap and he's pointing at the ground saying, "This is where the tubes were
Wait,
buried."
was it you?
I wish it were. I wish it had been. Next time, man. Next war. So that was like the key story, and like that again, Judy Miller could have just like screwed that up, that particular story. But how do you get through the layer after layer after layer of editors of the New York Times who are going to be like, yeah, that one sounds good. Like they won't allow you to publish like the lightest touch fact that might be somewhat not fully vetted and confirmed, and yet we have this massive piece that just makes it all the way through, gets to the front page, and a lot of Miller's stories were front page about this topic. And that is partly what happens where we get to this moment where the Bush administration can say, even the New York Times, the left leaning or left wing newspaper, says that this is true. We are going to war now. So the war breaks out, and
Wait, I just got to add one point for the kids who might not realize this. Not only was the argument constant, like Saddam has these weapons, it was also constant, he's about to use them. Like it was really part and parcel of the whole story of it. It's not like he's sitting on this stockpile. Like we have information, and it was never really clear to my memory where this information was coming from. But he's about to launch. Like we got to act fast. That was very much in the air. This kind of crisis of if we don't go in, he's going to start, mass murdering people, in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's right. Because the initial war was in Afghanistan because they had harbored Al Qaeda, and okay, so you have some sort of like some cause there. But then they pivot towards Iraq, and it was kind of like I remember being caught off guard by that, and then just kind of like I was in college at the time, and just thinking what is this about? And you don't really, it's just very murky. And then you hear WMD, and this term was just everywhere. WMD,
yes.
Like the whole country was talking about WMD all the time. And finally, when you have the New York Times say, "Oh yeah, he was developing and he is developing and could still continue to do this if we don't take care of the problem." So this happens. Then right on the back of it, the U.S. goes into Iraq, and the reporting blows up in Judy Miller and the New York Times face. But then you have literally days, I mean like 8, 9, 10 days into the war, you have this new narrative that these soldiers are coming back home just irrevocably damaged psychologically, physically. And a lot of this reporting was done by a young, on the rise Black reporter named Jason Blair. And Blair is doing this crazy Iraq reporting. He's all over the country talking to veterans who'd returned broken in spirit, body. And he's reporting a separate story about the DC sniper. Probably a lot of people won't remember, but we had this like scare of the sniper was just like killing people randomly when nobody knew where he was. He was just like shooting people with a sniper rifle. He's reporting all this stuff at the same time. And nobody realized at the New York Times that it was physically impossible for him to have been in the places he had claimed to be while reporting these stories. But again, they just kind of like turned their face away from it. They didn't think about it. They didn't want. Why? Because he was delivering the goods. The Times realized they had completely screwed up on the story of WMD. They were the cheerleader of the Bush administration, so they tacked the other way rapidly and started putting out this false narrative that all these soldiers were coming back broken and bruised when they weren't. The Times, in the sort of cleanup of this, went back to the same people he had supposedly interviewed. And these people said, "Yeah, I got injured, but I'm okay with it. I feel like I served my country." And they just had to go back and sort of mop this up for months and months. And again, it was a major blemish. But it was back to this idea that they blow with the wind. They're very attuned to which way the cultural winds are blowing, and that's the direction they go.
Guys, early this year, I went on a bulk, and I want to thank all the lovely fans out there for pointing out how fat and disgusting I look and how I look like shit. But now I'm leaning back out. And if you want to see how I look like lean, well, that's where sheath underwear comes in. So the first time I put on sheath underwear, this is way back in the Gas Digital days, I'm like, what the F is this crap? Because it's underwear with two pouches, patented dual pouch technology, one part for one part of your male anatomy, one part for another part of your male anatomy. And you're putting your boys in there, you're like, I don't know about this. And I have worn sheath every single day since then. It's the only underwear I wear because it is so damn comfortable. And try it out. At first, you'll be like, okay, Malice is crazy. No one's disputing that. But I'm not wrong that sheath is the most comfortable underwear you're ever going to wear in your life. And I got to tell you, there's something really fun about being on an interview, being on a date, and knowing your underwear is grabbing your junk in two different ways. And you're sitting there like totally normally, but you're thinking to yourself, if only they knew. Well, you know right now that I'm wearing sheath all the time, even in the shower. No, okay, not in the shower. I don't shower. So if you go to sheathunderwear.com, use promo code Malice, you get 20% off. They also have cool t-shirts. I wear the t-shirts to the gym. They've got new materials like bamboo. It sounds crazy, but it's actually softer than other stuff. Go to sheathunderwear.com, use promo code Malice. You get 20% off your order, and you'll see why it is something I have worn every day for years. Thank you, Sheath, for being such a longtime sponsor and having me in your ads. Hey, here's something disgusting. Traditional bed sheets can hold more bacteria than a toilet seat. Not exactly what you want to lay your face on. So Miracle Made bedding is designed to help fight bacteria and stay cleaner longer with silver-infused fabrics that actually help prevent up to 99.7% of bacterial growth. These Miracle Made sheets are crafted with NASA-inspired fabrics that help regulate your body temperature all night long. Thanks to Miracle Made's antibacterial silver technology, the sheets stay cleaner, fresher, up to 3 times longer than regular sheets. That means fewer odors, fewer wash cycles, and way less laundry. They feel just as good, if not better, than sheets you'd find at a 5-star hotel, but without the steep price tag. They're smooth, they're breathable, and they're ridiculously comfortable. All that hidden bacteria in regular sheets can clog your pores, cause breakouts. Miracle Made's antibacterial design helps you sleep cleaner and clearer night after night. Upgrade your sleep or give the gift of better rest. Go to trymiracle.com/malice to try Miracle Made sheets today. You'll save over 40%. Use promo code Malice, another 20% off, and a free 3-piece towel set. They make an amazing gift for your disgusting friends, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee, there's no risk. Try miracle.com/malice, code Malice at checkout, and you will be sleeping clean, healthy, and happy like you were meant to. And thank you to Miracle Made for making such great products and for sponsoring this episode. Let's get back to the show. Why do you think so? That was a huge scandal, and they had to walk it back, and they had to walk it back very publicly.
Yeah.
Why do you think that, and combined with the WMD stuff, didn't do more to damage their reputation culturally?
I think it did. I think they took a big hit on that. It took them a long time to recover. They fired the executive editor, Howell Raines, that I mentioned. They put in a real loyalist, Bill Keller, and it took years. It took years for them to get past that. But you have this compounding effect of being number one for so many decades.
Yeah.
You have the money that they had. They had a series of really bad investments as well that they also had to sort of work their way out of at the time. They invested heavily in local TV stations and local radio stations, and they took a sort of $1 billion write down on that. But at the end of the day, they crawled out of it. They had the Obama era sort of coming after
true.
that. They hit George Bush really hard. I mean, Maureen Dowd, who the famous New York Times columnist, it was just Bush, Bush, Bush all day, every day. We think about Trump today in the New York Times coverage and the media's coverage of Trump is sort of singular, like they uniquely hate him. And maybe it's like a little bit exaggerated, but George Bush was like basically a diabolical figure for the media after that initial honeymoon. Like it was just nonstop. barrage against Bush and the administration. Maybe some of that was justified. A lot of it
Yeah,
was.
I saw a documentary of Hubert Selby, the great transgressive writer who wrote the what's it called? Is it called The Room? His most famous book is Exit to Brooklyn, which was really this kind of revelatory move forward in terms of Requiem for a Dream. He wrote
Anyways.
Last Exit to Brooklyn and The Room. Yeah, and you watch this biography documentary about this author who really moved American culture. You could argue for worse because of the stuff he wrote about, and a big chunk of it was about like he really hated George Bush in the Iraq War, and it's like yeah, at the time, but at the time it was so taking up all the oxygen in the room. But in retrospect, it's like, okay, this guy had generic shit lib opinions. This is not interesting in a documentary of a guy's career. But I think nowadays people forget this was such a cultural marker to run your mouth. Oh, I hate George Bush. George Bush was terrible, and I don't think they're wrong, but I don't think it was interesting. Like, we get it. He's whatever. He's terrible, and this war was a mistake, so on and so forth. But you don't need to bring it up when we're talking about this ramen restaurant.
Yeah, it became all encompassing for sure. And then right after that, you start to see the emergence of the Occupy Wall Street movement,
Right.
and like this sort of this like flip towards leftism. And a lot of the stuff we're seeing today with Trump and like the No King stuff, you saw it in the Iraq War demonstrations where you're like, yeah, people were opposed to the war, but there also seemed to be another motive at work as well, which is kind of this generalized leftism, which again we saw with the Occupy stuff, and then it kind of bled into the Obama years, and then it was just like, the New York Times could own that coverage; they were still number one. It became just this generational shift. A lot of the stuff got forgotten, and they had a few relatively scandal-free years during that period, and I think they recovered their reputation. Bill Keller, who took over as editor, was widely thought to have done a very good job, and Dean Beckett, who succeeded him, also kind of moved in that further direction towards this like identity politics and bring the paper further leftward, which it seems like a strange move, but something worked. Like
Yeah.
they did something really right, and part of that was that expanding their offerings beyond news, like to include stuff like Wordle and The Athletic, and just really building a much bigger media property than it had before.
I remember Bill Keller when he was it executive editor? Is that his title?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was on The Daily Show. And The Daily Show at the time, maybe they still do it. I don't know anyone who's watched in over a decade. They would have these interviews, and it was always like, why are you doing this interview? Because they're there to make you look like a fool. And the guy interviewing Bill Keller of the New York Times says, hey, I got a joke for you. What's black and white and red all over? And Bill Keller goes, oh, I know that. A newspaper goes, no, your balance sheet, because they were hemorrhaging so much money at the time. And I remember people were like, yeah, the New York Times is going down. And I was on Gutfeld, I think February and March, and it was the first time I was back in several years. And he had this monologue about how the Democrats are never going to win again because all they stand for is terrible. And the first person spoke, and then it went to me, and there's a live audience there of like boomer tourists. And I said, guys, it's not even the end of the first quarter, and you're taking your victory lap. The Democratic Party is the oldest political party on earth. When Upton Sinclair ran for governor of California in 1934, after many years as a socialist, he registered as a Democrat because he said people will vote for the political party their grandfather voted for. And that's so this idea that an institution that's that long, that's on its back legs at a time like the New York Times is going anywhere. The New York Times was around before you, and they're getting around after you. So, this kind of fantasy that I know Rush Limbaugh talked about in the 90s of this imminent victory over these corrupted institutions, which I think some people thought Trump was going to bring about. It's like, you really need to take the long view, because they certainly are. And the New York Times knows they can take a few years in the wilderness, but things will cycle back. And if not, they'll adapt because they don't care.
Yeah, and even that the financial issues that they were having, they were severe. They plugged the hole. They took a loan from Carlos Slim, Mexican billionaire.
Right.
Not a very savory character, but again, like, what do they care? Like, it didn't bother them. All their ethics about billionaire control and money and the damage that people like Slim have done in the world, it just got shunted aside because it actually doesn't matter to them. What matters to them is staying number one, and they did. They paid off the Slim. It was a loan. Like, it converted some of it to stock, but it doesn't matter. They have a 2-tier stock structure. It's just something that they and the rest of the media excoriate other people for, including Zuckerberg at Facebook and Meta. But they have the same structure at the New York Times, so they cannot be dislodged. They cannot be outvoted. You could buy as many of the Class A shares, which is the general common stock, and it won't matter because their Class B stock will outweigh um, anything that you can do publicly. So they are here to stay. And I think your point about the left is absolutely correct. Like, we are not the if anything, it has gotten much worse. You just can't see it. It's like an infection that's like under the skin. It's The far left has made more inroads online, has built more audience, more allegiance, has reshaped the Democratic Party. We just saw it with Mamdani. And this is going to come spilling out sooner or later. I think we maybe have a little bit of like this kind of moment where it's just taking a deep breath, but it will come pouring out, and it's not going to be pretty. I think power will continue to be seated towards the far, far left. People that we wouldn't have imagined as even admissible as candidates like Mamdani, will continue to win elections in the United States in important races. Um, it's not over. It's the thing about the left, as and that you can read it in your book, is that it is inexorable. Its
Right. That's
only
the word.
mandate is to keep going, not only keep going, but to keep going further and further and further beyond every political or cultural excess.
And also, people have this idea, like, if you go back, the New York Times is so big on LGBT and rah, 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 rah. So people, this drives me crazy. Conservatives have this idea that the leftist sees these institutions as perpetual 20 years ago, right? And the New York Times would never denigrate gay people, blah, blah, blah. The New York Times audience is bougie whites and highly educated people. I'm not saying they're smart. I'm just saying on paper, they're highly educated. When the
Yeah.
AIDS crisis hit, they weren't the ones front and center covering it and being like, "Oh, these poor people." They ignored it because it didn't fit into their narrative. It was messy. It was a lot of sex, which they didn't want to talk about, and it wasn't our people who were getting it. So we're not going to discuss it. So, and just the same. I don't know if you saw this. This is rent free in my head. Nancy Pelosi. Did you see her retirement video?
Only a short clip.
Okay, 6 minutes long, right? So there's no shortage of time. Nancy Pelosi of San Francisco, far right fascist beacon. 6 minutes long. She talks about AIDS at length, which obviously affected her community. She never says the word gay or homosexual or LGBT or trans in reference to AIDS, even. She never mentions black people or people of color. When she talks about diversity, I think it's like a white family on the screen. She talks about how much she loves Veterans Day parade. Oh, look, there's a Veterans Day parade. And St. Francis of Assisi. I'm so proud. The gender's falling out. I'm so proud to be a servant of St. Francis of Assisi. And it's like, when's the last time you heard Nancy Pelosi talk about St. Francis of Assisi? I'm sure as a Catholic, she does look up to him. He's a very,
Mhm.
easy figure to admire, but this is clearly a positioning thing. She's very, very shrewd.
Yes.
To your point, I'm curious because I do think they're already pivoting in their messaging away from this woke stuff. Like you said, the 1619 Project. I don't think the New York Times would launch it today. I think what they're going to try to do is reclaim quote unquote Americanism and try to position MAGA as fundamentally un-American. And if the two candidates, one had military service, if they have the right iconography, they would easily make that case for a lot of swing voters.
Yeah, I think that's generally correct. We'll see. We'll see where they take this. The He's not quite new at this point, but the new-ish editor, Joseph Kahn, he is
Oh,
much
Dean left.
more.
They replaced him.
Yeah, Dean McKay retired.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, that was probably 2 years ago, maybe by now, maybe more. Um, Joe Kahn is a journalistic China expert. And that's not insignificant either, because they understand it's still a global world.
Yep.
That we may have had this pushback on globalism and towards this sort of America first stuff, but economically, realistically, this is a global world, and they are still very interested in that market. Sort of like skirting your question a little bit, because I don't actually know exactly how they're going to take this on, but I suspect, yes, they're going to steer well clear of woke. It's not a winning message. It doesn't do well with audiences. People are tired of it. They're tired of the identity politics. They are also they're pushing back. They've stirred a lot of controversy in the last few weeks with a few op-eds, and I think even an editorial. One was about women in the workplace. This crazy op-ed that like is saying women are creating like a hostile environment, like their presence. It was a really quite insane. They've also really gotten a lot of backlash from the LGBTQ communities, including from GLAAD, because of their take on trans stuff. So they are sort of doing this switch back on these key landmark woke issues. They've reported on, what's his name, Ibrahim Zendi, whatever, however you pronounce that. His thing falling apart at Boston University, his $40 million institute there. So they are pivoting. The question is, what are they pivoting towards?
Right.
I don't quite understand yet. I actually read the New York Times every single day, so I'm not totally sure.
It's not going to be anything good. I think we can agree on that.
Hey, it's James Altucher. I've been an entrepreneur, investor, best-selling writer, stand-up comic, and whatever it is I'm interested in, I get obsessed. Yes, it's led to success, but it's also led to such heartbreaking failure. I have failed more times than I can count. I wish in my life I had had people to talk to. That's why I started the James Altucher Show and bring on some of the most brilliant minds in every area of life. People like Richard Branson, Sarah Blakely, Mark Cuban, Danica Patrick, Gary Kasparov, and I wanted to find out exactly how they've navigated the highs, the lows, and everything in between. No fluff, just raw stories and real advice. I've talked to 1,500 of the most amazing people on the planet. So if you want to learn from the best and skip the same old canned interviews, we're all about helping you find your next big idea, level up your thinking, and ultimately to choose yourself. So let's do this together. Subscribe now to the James Altucher Show.
Let's get back to the show. So I'm curious, what are some of the other things that you uncovered in your research that people might not be aware of in terms of their long and bloody history?
A couple highlights, I would say, are the New York Times' involvement with Fidel Castro, which was unbelievable. I mean, overt and determinative. Fidel Castro, at the time that the New York Times correspondent, Herbert Matthews, sought him out in the mountains of Cuba, was an unknown figure, completely irrelevant, and all but defeated. The Times then puts Castro on the cover of the newspaper multiple times, proclaiming him the democratic savior of Cuba. They had no knowledge of whether or not Castro would be democratic or anything else. Obviously, we now do. And they revitalize him. They revive him. They bring him back from political dead, to the point that when Castro visited the United States as the leader of Cuba after the revolution, one of his first stops in New York was the New York Times. He personally thanked the publisher and the reporter, Matthews, for their service to the state of Cuba. And Che Guevara was on record saying the New York Times did more for the cause, the Castro cause, than any fighter on the battlefield ever could have, which is absolutely true. You would not have had a Castro without the New York Times supporting him. That was quite something to learn.
One of the greatest moments of my life was being the one to tell my Cuban friend that Castro had died. That was something that is a privilege no one's going to take away from me. I did not know what you just said, and that's just disturbing beyond words.
Yeah, and it goes deeper and deeper. The chapter I have on that, I really go into a lot of detail on how that worked and why they did it, and what they got out of it. The other the other episode that literally nobody talks about, I've never heard anyone talk about this, is really weird, is that the New York Times collaborated with the Department of War, as it was called at the time, and the United States Department of War, to cover up radiation poisoning as a result of the atomic bomb. So when they dropped the atomic bomb, it was sort of like, you could just think it through from the physics standpoint, to understand there was going to be radiation poisoning, but the government didn't want the American public to know this.
You mean Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or testing here?
Hiroshima and Nagasaki,
okay.
And later on testing in the Marshall Islands.
Okay.
Because, or generally speaking, why? Because you didn't want to freak out the public. To say we have this amazing bomb, and it's just like a normal bomb that you understand very well, like World War II stuff that we've been dropping on Germany. It's just way bigger, way more powerful. Okay, that's a very different story to tell than this is a totally new type of technology, and there are invisible particles in the air that could blow across from Japan to the west coast of the United States.
That's right, of course,
harm Americans. Like, no, they could not say that. So,
or even harm American troops or people stationed in Korea or our allies in Korea, or just innocent people anywhere.
Or just people. Or just people. They're, that too. So the Times, they had this amazing science reporter whose name was William Lawrence. And he used to just do this fantastic reporting on the advent of all the particle physics that was going on in the early 40s. To the point where the Times got warned by the government that he had to tone it down because he was actually giving away secrets because the reporting was so good. And then he abruptly just stops reporting on nuclear physics, and he's reporting about cancer and cigarettes and vitamin C and just the most mundane, boring stuff ever. Turns out he had struck a deal. The New York Times had struck a deal with the Department of War to cover up radiation poisoning as a result of the nuclear bombs. William Lawrence actually helped the Department of War write propaganda pamphlets about the bomb. And quid pro quo, in exchange, what does he get? The only reporter to be on the bombing run of the dropping of the nuclear weapons on Japan, that was on Nagasaki, was William Lawrence. He was given this opportunity. No one else got it. He covered it for the New York Times. He got the story. His story was reporting from one of the planes it wasn't the one that actually dropped the weapon, but it was on the bombing run with them. He describes the mushroom cloud with his own eyes.
Oh my God!
I've seen it. And turns out he was also deeply involved in the Manhattan Project. He was on the ground for a lot of the testing. This was all very secret until it wasn't. They then revealed it. And that was the deal. And they executed on it, did a great job.
It's funny because people understand, I think, logically, there is going to be a lot of interconnectivity, for lack of a better word, between powerful government actors and agencies like the Times, Washington Post, so on and so forth. And in a sense, it's inevitable, because if I'm covering the State Department, I'm going to be talking I'm going to develop human beings are human beings. You talk to a guy every so often, you're going to develop a relationship. It's just kind of human nature. But I think they don't really apply that filter to any specific story. So they understand generally it's happening, but they don't realize, okay, that finger's on the button in every story, because every story that the Times puts out, if I'm in the Commerce Department, about the Commerce Department, I'm reading it and it's affecting me. And if it's pissing me off, we have a problem. And the reporter knows it's a problem. And at a certain point, okay, they're going to have to pull that trigger. But at the other point, it's do I want to, as the reporter, am I burning the bridge with my sources, upsetting their apple cart too much? Then they're not going to return my calls. So it's kind of this incestuous relationship. So the thing to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, which is the most disingenuous, is claims that corporate media speaks truth to power. That to me is the most unhinged. If you saw this during COVID, even if you think everything about COVID was done correctly, they were very clearly parroting the narratives of governments and pharmaceutical companies. They were not in any way challenging. In fact, they were denigrating anyone who challenged any part of the narrative, let's assume it was true, of pharmaceutical companies and the government.
Yeah, and when you say speaking truth to power, what sort of gets omitted from that implicitly is that they are the power.
That's right. Yeah,
It's not like
that's right.
when with the New York
Yeah.
Times, when like you see this is something a point that a mutual friend of ours makes a lot, which is that you often see the media talk a lot about Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or any other business leader or political leader. You never, but I mean never, see a story, good or bad, about Arthur Sulzberger Jr.
That's right.
Ever. You don't know about his family. You don't know how the stock structure works. And I'm not just talking about the New York Times not reporting on this. I'm talking about anybody. It's not in the Washington Post. It's not in Axios or NBC. It's like an omerta, like a code where you don't talk about this thing, even though it's incredibly important. It really, really does matter who is the guy who single-handedly
Yeah, of
controls the New York
course.
Times. So this is the truth to power thing, and the COVID thing as well. I think the COVID thing is it runs deeper than pharmaceutical stuff. I don't fully understand it. I did a lot of reporting on COVID origin back in 2021, 2022.
Oh, so you're a racist.
Yeah, yeah. According to the New York Times science reporter, yes, I would be a racist. Yes,
You're racist.
I'm
The
a
one
COVID
time they
racist.
care about anti-Asian racism is when it's the
Yeah,
COVID origins. That's the one time they care about.
exactly. And they promulgated that. She got sort of dinged on that later in 2021, but the New York Times had come out with this narrative about a lab leak being a fringe conspiracy theory in February 2020. February. That a pandemic hadn't even been declared. A pandemic was declared in March, and they came out this story. That story, when you go back and you look at it, it was both the Times, the Times and the Washington Post did a story on the same day using almost identical headlines. It was about Tom Cotton, who was just literally asking questions, not in like a Candace Owens way, but literally like, we need to know, was this from an animal? Was it from a lab?
Yeah.
What are the other sources that we should explore? That's all he said in the Senate. And the Times publishes the story saying he was repeating conspiracy theories, and there was scientific consensus, which I don't know how there possibly could be at that point. But the weird thing with all of this was that 1 week before that story came out in the Times, China Daily, which is a Chinese propaganda outlet, printed almost exactly the same thing on the same topic involving Tom Cotton. There are uncanny similarities. The other very strange thing about this story is that when the Times ran it about COVID lab leak being a conspiracy theory, they didn't assign a health reporter or a science reporter to write that story. That would have been like the completely natural thing. They assigned a business reporter based in Hong Kong, whose father was he was a journalist, well known for working with intelligence agencies throughout the course of his career. So again, it's just not to say this woman is involved. There's never been any evidence of that. I'm not saying that she is. Her name is Alexandra Stevenson. I actually read a book about her father. It's called A Man Called Intrepid. But these things are very strange, and it is very strange to be calling lab leak a conspiracy theory a month before the pandemic was even declared.
I'll tell you my favorite New York Times story that happened to me personally. My friend worked there. I'm in the elevator with her and a couple other people. And I mentioned, because we had just left the lunchroom and Maureen Dowd had been there. And I tell my friend, wow, I can't believe I missed my chance to punch Maureen Dowd in the face. And my friend, who's never done this before, since goes, like almost cartoonish. And I took the hint and I shut up. And I hadn't realized that the other person in the elevator was Arthur Sulzberger.
Oh, which it was
The
it
older
was
one.
AG.
The
The
older
father.
one.
The father.
Yeah.
Oh wow.
So
Hilarious.
I did not get her fired, but it was a very, very funny moment. I think that the recent elections made a lot of people realize that what I'd been saying for months was true. And that, when a party has nothing left, when they're just completely kind of decimated in a sense as Democrats were, although they almost have the House, they almost have the Senate, you know what I mean? That gives them an opportunity because now they can be like, all right, we could throw out everything against the wall, see what sticks, and we go with that. We have nothing to lose because we're at the bottom. So they're coming back hard. And I think the midterms are going to be disastrous. And that's going to be first and foremost fueled by agencies like the New York Times. Ashley, we're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
I think it might have been the joke about me being the guy who tipped off Judy Miller about WMDs, because that that would have been a life crowning achievement. But yeah, I just love talking about this stuff. I hopefully I'm doing a lot of investigation right now into Wikipedia, which is very similar in a way to the Times dynamics and the phenomenon of the New York Times. It's just less seen because it sort of operates underground, like it's as they call it themselves, the global knowledge infrastructure. So you don't actually see the piping. You don't actually see how they're piping in it. It's the way Wikipedia works. I won't get into this too much because I know we're winding down, but they rely on reliable sources. And the very first reliable source, when they first made that list, a guy named Mr. X, who subsequently disappeared from the platform, he created a reliable list on Wikipedia, what can be cited and what cannot be cited. The very first reliable outlet was the New York Times on that list. There were only two. The unreliable was the Daily Mail. So the Wikipedia kind of pipes information from the mainstream media into the broader internet. And it's another piece of this puzzle, trying to understand how information actually works and trying to tell the meta story about journalism and about information online, which is mostly where information is today. So hopefully we'll get to have that conversation too.
You are welcome.
This November, action is free on Pluto TV. Go on the run with Jack Reacher.
Every suspect was a train killer.
Then buckle up for Drive, World War Z.
Every human being we save is one less to fight.
And Charlie's Angels.
Damn, I hate to fly.
Launch into sci-fi adventure with The Fifth Element and laugh through the mayhem in Tropic Thunder.
What is going on here?
All the thrills, all for free. Pluto TV. Stream now. Pay never.